Blood is blood, mistakes don't inherit, my Uncle Richard declared across the mahogany conference table, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had spent 60 years believing his position in the family was unassailable. My father built this empire for legitimate Harrington heirs, not for accidents that should have been handled quietly decades ago. My cousins clinked their champagne glasses in premature celebration while I sat silently in the corner chair I'd been assigned, the seat furthest from the family, closest to the door. But why did the estate lawyer, Mr. Nathaniel Cross, clear his throat with visible discomfort, and why did he unfold a second document that no one in the room had anticipated? Before we proceed with the standard will, I'm required to read a separate document. A letter your father wrote 6 months before his death, witnessed by 3 attorneys and notarized for legal authentication. Richard's confident expression flickered. What letter? I reviewed all the estate documents. This letter was held in separate trust, Mr. Harrington. Your father specifically requested it remain sealed until this reading. Mr. Cross adjusted his glasses. It begins, to my only legitimate heir, the granddaughter they tried to hide, the child of my firstborn son, the one person in this family who carries my blood without carrying my shame. The champagne glasses stopped mid-air. Every eye in the room turned toward me. And for the first time in 28 years, I smiled at my father's family. I was born a secret. My father, Thomas Harrington, was the eldest son of the Harrington dynasty, first in line to inherit the real estate empire his father had built over 50 years. He was supposed to marry appropriately, produce acceptable heirs, and continue the family legacy. Instead, he fell in love with my mother. Diana Okonkwo was a law student, brilliant and beautiful, working as a summer clerk at a firm that handled Harrington business. Thomas was 24, rebellious, and convinced that love mattered more than family expectations. They married secretly. I was born 11 months later. When the family discovered the marriage, and me, they reacted with the coordinated fury of people protecting an empire. My grandmother threatened disinheritance. My Uncle Richard, already positioning himself as the responsible heir, called my mother the help and suggested my father handle the situation. The situation was me. A baby. Their grandchild and niece. My father chose his family's money over his wife and daughter. The marriage was annulled. My mother received a settlement that was generous by normal standards and insulting by Harrington standards. I was erased from family records, never acknowledged, raised to understand that my father's family considered me a mistake that should never have happened. My grandfather, William Harrington, had been different. I'd met him exactly once, when I was 7 years old. My mother had taken me to a park near the Harrington estate, and an elderly man had approached our bench with tears in his eyes. "You're Diana, aren't you? And this is?" He'd knelt down to my level. "This is Amelia." "Mr. Harrington, please," my mother had started. "I just wanted to see her. Once. To know she's real." He touched my cheek with trembling fingers. "She has Thomas's eyes." My eyes. "Your family made their position clear, my family made their position clear. I never agreed with it. I never will." He pressed an envelope into my mother's hands. "For her education. Don't tell anyone. Just, make sure she has opportunities." The envelope contained $50,000 in bearer bonds. Untraceable. My mother had used it for my private school tuition, never explaining where the money came from. I'd learned the truth only after her death, when I found the envelope and the note inside, for my granddaughter. Blood is blood. W.H. My father died when I was 19. Thomas Harrington had remarried appropriately after annulling his marriage to my mother, a woman from a suitable family who produced 2 sons, my half-brothers. He'd never contacted me, never acknowledged my existence, never sent birthday cards or graduation congratulations. His death notice described him as devoted father to Richard Jr. and James, and beloved husband to Catherine. No mention of a first marriage. No mention of a daughter. I'd attended the funeral from a distance, watching the family I'd never been allowed to join mourn the father I'd never been allowed to know. My grandfather had been there, older and frilier, and for one moment our eyes had met across the cemetery. He'd nodded. Just once. An acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered, that blood was blood regardless of what the family proclaimed. Then he'd turned away, surrounded by the relatives who would have been horrified to know he'd seen me. My grandfather died 3 months ago. William Harrington was 92 years old, the patriarch of an empire worth approximately $340 million in real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and business interests. His death had been reported in financial publications nationwide. I'd expected nothing from his estate. Why would I? The family had spent 28 years pretending I didn't exist. My presence at the will reading was purely technical. Mr. Cross had contacted me, explaining that I was mentioned in the documents and my attendance was legally required. I'd assumed it was something humiliating. A token bequest designed to prove the family's generosity. Or perhaps a formal acknowledgement of my illegitimacy, documented for legal purposes. Instead, I'd walked into a revelation that would restructure everything. Mr. Cross continued reading the letter. I have watched my family destroy what mattered most. I watched them pressure Thomas into abandoning his wife and child. I watched them erase Amelia from our history as if she never existed. I watched my grandchildren grow up believing they were entitled to everything while the eldest grandchild, my firstborn, was denied even acknowledgement. I tried to help quietly. The money for her education. Anonymous support when I could manage it without detection. But quiet help doesn't correct public wrong. I've spent 20 years preparing to correct this wrong. The documents in this letter will explain everything. My attorneys have verified every detail. The truth cannot be suppressed any longer. Richard interrupted. Father was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote this. We'll contest any documents. Mr. Harrington, your father underwent cognitive evaluation 6 months before his death, at his own request, specifically to establish competency for these documents. He was found to be of sound mind by 3 independent psychiatrists. Richard's face reddened. This is absurd. Please allow me to continue. The letter continued with historical reconstruction. When Thomas married Diana, it was not a reckless mistake. It was a legal marriage, properly conducted, witnessed, and documented. The annulment my wife and Richard arranged was fraudulent, based on false claims of coercion that Diana never agreed to. I have obtained the original marriage documents. I have obtained Diana's signed statement, made before her death, confirming the marriage was valid and the annulment was conducted without her consent. Under state law, if the annulment was fraudulent, the marriage remained valid. If the marriage remained valid, Thomas's children with Catherine were born while he was still legally married to Diana. This means Amelia is not illegitimate. She is the only legitimate child of my eldest son. Richard Jr. and James, though raised as Harringtons, were technically born outside of wedlock. The room erupted. My cousins, half-brothers, technically, shouted protests. Aunt Catherine, my father's second wife, went pale. Uncle Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. Thomas and Diana's marriage was annulled. The annulment was based on fraudulent testimony, Mr. Cross said calmly. Mr. Harrington's letter includes documentation. Diana Okonkwo signed an affidavit before her death stating she never consented to the annulment, was never properly served with documents, and discovered the marriage had been dissolved only after the fact. She was lying. The documentation includes correspondence from the law firm that handled the annulment, confirming that Diana's signature on the consent forms was forged. Mr. Harrington hired forensic document analysts who verified the forgery. The legal implications were staggering. If my parents' marriage had never been validly annulled, my father had committed bigamy when he married Catherine. His sons with her, raised as legitimate heirs, were technically illegitimate. And I, the child they'd called a mistake, the granddaughter they'd tried to hide, was the only legitimate heir of the eldest Harrington son. Your father's will divides his estate according to legitimate bloodline, Mr. Cross explained. He specifically structured the trust to benefit legitimate descendants. If Amelia is the only legitimate child of Thomas, she inherits his share of the estate. What share? Richard demanded. As the eldest son, Thomas was entitled to 40% of William Harrington's estate. That percentage now transfers to his only legitimate heir. I did the math quickly. 40% of $340 million. $136 million. Uncle Richard's legal challenges began the next day. He filed motions contesting the will, challenging the document analysis, questioning my grandfather's competency despite the psychiatric evaluations. He claimed fraud, manipulation, and exploitation of an elderly man by unknown parties. The court proceedings lasted 8 months. During that time, the evidence my grandfather had assembled proved overwhelming. The original marriage certificate, never properly voided. The forged consent documents, analyzed by 3 independent experts. My mother's affidavit, notarized 5 years before her death, describing exactly how she'd been excluded from the annulment process. My grandfather had spent 20 years building this case. He'd hired investigators, attorneys, forensic specialists. He'd documented everything, anticipated every challenge, prepared for exactly the legal assault Richard would mount. Why didn't he do this while he was alive? I asked Mr. Cross during one meeting. He tried, early on. Your grandmother threatened to divorce him and take half the estate. Your uncle threatened to have him declared incompetent. The family closed ranks against him. Mr. Cross paused. He told me once that he knew he couldn't win while alive. His only power was in death, when they couldn't threaten him anymore, couldn't manipulate him, couldn't stop him from finally telling the truth. He waited 20 years. He waited until his wife died, until he'd accumulated enough documentation to be irrefutable, until he'd structured the estate in ways that couldn't be easily challenged. Mr. Cross smiled slightly. Your grandfather was a patient man. And a strategic one. The final ruling came 14 months after the will reading. The court found that the annulment of my parents' marriage had been fraudulently obtained, that my mother had never consented to the dissolution, and that the marriage therefore remained valid until my father's death. This meant I was, legally, the only legitimate child of Thomas Harrington. It meant my half-brothers, Richard Jr. and James, were technically illegitimate, born during their father's bigamous second marriage. And it meant my grandfather's will, which specifically designated inheritance for legitimate descendants, applied to me alone. The estate distribution was restructured accordingly. The $136 million was only part of the revelation. My grandfather had left additional provisions in his letter, provisions that revealed how much he'd been watching, how much he'd known, how much he'd cared despite his inability to act publicly. I tracked Amelia's education through the school records I was able to access. Graduated valedictorian. Full scholarship to Columbia. Law degree with honors. She built a career in civil rights litigation, advocating for people who've been wronged by those with power. She became exactly the kind of person I hoped she would be. Not because of the family's influence, but despite their rejection. The Harrington name didn't make her, she made herself. I want her to know that I watched. That I was proud. That every achievement she earned without our help made me more certain that she was the heir this family needed, not the mistake they tried to forget. The money is irrelevant. She's already proven her worth. But the acknowledgement matters. The truth matters. After 28 years of lies, my granddaughter deserves to know that she was never illegitimate. She was never a mistake. She was always a Harrington, whether this family admitted it or not. I'd cried when Mr. Cross read those words. Not for the money, for the recognition. For knowing that someone in that family had seen me, had valued me, had believed in me even when he couldn't say so publicly. The family's reaction to the ruling was predictable. Richard refused to speak to me, referring to the situation only through attorneys. His sons, my half-brothers, contested every distribution, delaying the estate settlement for months with legal maneuvering. Catherine, my father's second wife, surprised me by reaching out. I didn't know, she said when we met. About the fraudulent annulment. About how they treated your mother. Thomas told me his first marriage had been a youthful mistake, properly dissolved. I didn't know it was still valid. Would it have mattered? I don't know. I loved Thomas. But I also thought I was marrying an honorable man. She paused, discovering that our entire marriage was technically bigamous, that my sons are what the family called you for 28 years, has restructured everything I thought I knew. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for our sons, yours and mine. They grew up believing they were better than you, entitled to things you weren't. Now they're learning that legitimacy was just a story the family told to justify their cruelty. I didn't take the full inheritance. The legal ruling entitled me to everything the will designated for legitimate descendants. But applying that ruling fully would have devastated people who been lied to as much as I had. Richard Jr. and James hadn't chosen to be born during their father's bigamous marriage. They hadn't known their legitimacy was based on fraud. They were victims of the same family system that had victimized me, just from a different angle. I proposed a settlement. The inheritance would be split according to the original will's intent, as if all of Thomas's children were legitimate. I would receive my share, they would receive theirs, and we would all walk away with enough to build our lives. Richard Sr. objected, of course. He wanted to fight until nothing remained. But his sons, surprisingly, accepted. You could have taken everything, James told me during the mediation. The ruling gave you the right. The ruling gave me legal authority. That's not the same as right. I looked at my half-brother, this stranger who shared my blood but not my history. We were all damaged by what this family did. I'm not interested in extending that damage. Why not? After how they treated you. Because I spent 28 years being defined by their cruelty. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life returning it. The final distribution gave me approximately $45 million. Enough to transform my life. Enough to establish the foundation my grandfather had suggested in his letter, support for children of mixed-race families, educational scholarships for first-generation students, legal advocacy for people who'd been wronged by powerful families. The Diana Okonkwo Foundation opened 2 years after the estate was settled. My mother's name, finally attached to resources that could help people like her, brilliant, capable people who'd been destroyed by families that considered them unsuitable. My half-brothers and I have an uneasy relationship. We're not close, too much history, too many lies, too many years of them believing they were superior to the mistake their family had hidden. But we're civil. We acknowledge each other. We're working towards something that might, eventually, resemble family. Uncle Richard never accepted any of it. He died last year, still insisting the ruling was fraudulent, still claiming I'd manipulated a senile old man into rewriting his will. He went to his grave believing legitimacy was about documentation rather than love. I visit my grandfather's grave every year on the anniversary of that will reading. I bring flowers, the same yellow roses he'd sent anonymously to my college graduation, to my law school commencement, to my mother's funeral. I discovered the source of those flowers only after his death, when Mr. Cross showed me the standing orders he'd maintained for decades. You were there, I tell him. Even when you couldn't be there. You watched, you helped, you waited until you could finally tell the truth. The headstone reads simply, William Harrington. Beloved father and grandfather. I'm the granddaughter the family tried to hide. But I was always his, whether they acknowledged it or not. They called me a mistake for 28 years. They erased me from family records, refused to speak my name, built their inheritance on the assumption that I was nothing. But my grandfather was watching. Building evidence. Preparing the revelation that would restructure everything. The annulment was fraudulent. The marriage was valid. The illegitimate child was the only legitimate heir. They raised their glasses to celebrate keeping me out. Then the lawyer read the letter that would let me in, and prove that blood is blood meant something very different than they'd assumed. My grandfather waited 20 years to tell the truth. The truth was worth waiting for.